My name is Harlow, and I'm 29 years old. The pain started on a Tuesday afternoon while I was restocking shelves at the pharmacy where I'd worked for 6 years. A sharp twist low in my abdomen that folded me over an aisle display of vitamins before I even understood what was happening. My coworker Reeve found me on the floor, my face gray, sweat soaking through my shirt, and she didn't waste time asking questions. She called an ambulance while I tried to tell her I was fine, that it was probably just something I ate, but my body was screaming a different story and she knew it. By the time the paramedics loaded me into the back of the ambulance, the pain had become something I couldn't speak through, only breathe through in short, ragged gasps. At the hospital, things moved fast in a way that terrified me more than the pain itself. A doctor pressed on my stomach and I nearly came off the table. Within 20 minutes, I heard the word appendix and then rupture and then surgery now, and everything blurred into fluorescent lights and gloved hands and a nurse named Dessa asking me, in a calm voice that didn't match the urgency on her face, who my emergency contact was. I gave her my parents' number without hesitation. Of course I did. They were my parents. Who else would I call in the worst moment of my life? Dessa stepped out to make the call while another nurse started in four in my arm, and I lay there trying to hold on to some thread of calm, telling myself this was routine, that people had their appendix out all the time, that in a few hours I'd be groggy and sore but fine. I kept picturing my mother's voice picking up, imagining she'd already be grabbing her keys, that my father would be pulling up his shoes by the door. That image was the only thing keeping me steady as they wheeled me toward pre-op. Dessa came back sooner than I expected, and something in her expression had shifted. She leaned close and told me the calls weren't going through, that both numbers went straight to a message saying the phones were switched off. Not busy. Not unanswered. Off. I remember blinking at her, certain I'd misunderstood. Because my mother's phone was practically fused to her hand, she checked it during dinner, during movies, during church, and my father never let his battery drop below 50% out of some paranoid habit he'd had since I was a kid. Both of them off at the exact hour I was being wheeled into emergency surgery. I told Dessa to try again, that there had to be a mistake. Maybe I'd given her the wrong digits in my panic, but I recited the numbers back to her clearly and she confirmed she'd dialed them exactly as given. Off. Both of them. At the same time. I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the anesthesia they were prepping, a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. Something between confusion and a betrayal I wasn't ready to call by its real name. I asked if there was anyone else listed on my intake form, some backup contact from years ago I might have forgotten about, and Dessa glanced at her tablet and told me there was, in fact, one more name on file, someone I hadn't listed in a long time and honestly hadn't thought about in months. I asked her who it was, my voice thin and scared, the anesthesiologist already adjusting the mask near my face, the clock draining away whatever time I had to understand what was happening before I went under. Dessa hesitated for just a second, the kind of hesitation that told me this answer mattered more than she wanted to let on, and then she said the name out loud, watching my face carefully as she did, like she needed to see how I'd react to it. The room tilted. Not from the anesthesia, not yet, but from the sound of that name landing in a moment when I was at my most powerless, strapped down and frightened and completely unable to do anything about what it meant that this particular person was the one being called instead of my own parents. I wanted to ask 100 questions. I wanted Dessa to explain everything right then, but the mask came down over my mouth and nose and the ceiling lights above me smeared into streaks of white, and the last thought I had before the darkness took me under was a single desperate question echoing through my mind. Why would the hospital be calling him, of all people, and why in the one moment I needed my parents most? Had they made absolutely sure they couldn't be reached at all? I woke up in recovery with my throat dry and my abdomen aching under layers of bandage, the world swimming back into focus in pieces. First sound, then light, then the shape of someone sitting beside my bed. I turned my head, expecting maybe a nurse checking my vitals, but instead I found myself looking into the face of my Uncle Desmond, my father's older brother, a man I hadn't spoken to directly in almost 2 years because of a falling out between him and my parents that no one in the family ever fully explained to me. He was holding my hand, and the moment my eyes focused on him, his shoulders sagged with relief, like he'd been holding his breath since he walked in. He explained everything slowly, giving me time to process each piece before adding the next. Apparently, years ago, when I first started at the pharmacy and filled out my emergency contact forms during a routine benefits update, I had listed Desmond as a secondary contact, almost as an afterthought, back when he and I were still close, before whatever rift happened between the brothers. I barely remembered doing it. But the hospital system still had his number on file, untouched, exactly as I'd entered it years before, and when my parents' phones failed to connect, Dessa had gone down the list and found his name waiting there like a forgotten safety net. Desmond told me he'd driven 90 minutes without stopping the second he got the call, terrified he wouldn't make it in time, and that he'd been sitting in that recovery room chair for almost 4 hours waiting for me to wake up. I asked him, my voice cracking, if he'd heard from my parents at all, if he knew why both their phones had gone dark at the exact same time on the one day I needed them most. His jaw tightened, and I watched him debate how much to tell me, the same hesitation Dessa had shown before surgery, and I told him I needed the truth, that I'd earned it lying in this hospital bed not knowing if my own parents cared whether I lived or died. He finally told me that my parents had been at a resort 2 hours away, celebrating their anniversary with a weekend they'd specifically requested to be uninterrupted, phones switched off, do not disturb mode activated on purpose, a tradition they'd started years ago that meant total disconnection from everyone, including me. It wasn't a plot against me, it wasn't malice, but hearing it didn't soften anything, because the truth was almost harder to accept than a dramatic betrayal would have been. My own parents had made a conscious choice, a standing rule, to be unreachable no matter what happened in the outside world, and it just so happened that what happened was their daughter nearly dying on an operating table. When my mother finally turned her phone back on the next morning and saw 11 missed calls and a wall of frantic texts, she called me sobbing, saying she never imagined anything could go wrong in one weekend, that the tradition had always felt harmless before. I listened to her apology, and I believed she meant it, but something in me had shifted permanently, a quiet recalibration of who I could count on when it mattered most. My father echoed the same regret when he called an hour later, his voice heavy with guilt, but by then Desmond had already fed me ice chips, already adjusted my pillow, already sat through the hardest hours of my recovery without needing to be asked. Over the following weeks, as I healed, something unexpected happened. Desmond started visiting regularly, first to check on my recovery, then just to talk, and slowly the 2-year silence between him and the rest of the family began to thaw, not because of some grand reconciliation speech, but because a crisis had forced the truth into the open and reminded everyone how fragile these connections really are. My parents and I are working things out too, in smaller, quieter ways, but I've stopped assuming their presence will always be automatic, and I've started building a support system that doesn't depend on any single phone staying charged. Looking back at that night, strapped to a gurney and hearing my uncle's name called out instead of my parents', I think about how close I came to going into that operating room completely alone, and how a decision I made years earlier without even thinking about it turned out to be the thing that saved me from that. It taught me something I don't think I'll ever forget, that the people we count on aren't always the ones who show up, and the ones who show up aren't always the people we expected. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about who's really on your own emergency contact list, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because these are the real, raw stories I share every single week, and I don't want you to miss the next one.